She stood there, frozen in the middle of Fifth Avenue, her breath catching in her throat like she'd been punched in the chest. People rushed past her, briefcases swinging, headphones in, oblivious to the fact that her entire world had just shattered. Across the street, sitting on a piece of cardboard with a styrofoam cup in front of him, was a man she thought she knew. A man she had trusted. A man who had listened to her deepest fears, her greatest regrets, the parts of herself she'd never shown anyone else. And now, staring at him through the blur of passing taxis and pedestrians, she realized she had never known him at all. He had sat there night after night, pretending to be someone he wasn't, while she poured her heart out like a fool. The betrayal didn't just sting, it burned, deep and humiliating, because she had believed in something that was never real. She had trusted him with her story, never knowing the truth he was hiding. And now, as their eyes met across the chaos of the city, she had to decide whether the connection they shared was built on love or lies. Her hands trembled as she gripped her purse, her mind racing through every conversation they'd ever had, every moment of vulnerability she'd given him, wondering how much of it had been part of his game. The man across the street, the one in torn jeans and a faded jacket, wasn't homeless at all. He was a billionaire, and she had fallen in love with a ghost. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And if you're new here, click on the subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Richard Blake was the kind of man people thought they knew. At 38, he had the type of presence that turned heads in boardrooms and restaurants. Not because he was loud or flashy, but because he carried himself with the quiet confidence of someone who had built something real. He owned a successful investment firm in Manhattan, lived in a penthouse overlooking Central Park, and was invited to every charity gala, every rooftop party, every exclusive event where the city's elite gathered to see and be seen. His face had appeared in Forbes, in Business Insider, in the glossy pages of magazines that profiled successful entrepreneurs who'd made their fortunes before 40. He had everything that society told him would make him happy. The money, the status, the respect, the admiration. But here's the thing about Richard that no one really understood. He was profoundly lonely. Not in the way people joke about being single or needing a vacation, but in the kind of deep, aching way that keeps you up at 3 in the morning staring at the ceiling, wondering if anyone would care about you if all the money disappeared. He had dated plenty of women over the years, beautiful, intelligent, successful women, but every relationship followed the same script. They'd be charmed by him at first, drawn to his intelligence and his calm demeanor, but eventually the focus would shift. It always did. They'd start asking about his properties, his portfolio, his plans for expansion. They'd want to be seen with him at the right events, photographed with him at the right tables. And slowly, painfully, Richard would realize that they weren't interested in him. They were interested in what he represented. Wealth, status, security, the validation that came with being attached to a man like him. And every single time, it broke him a little more. The breaking point came on a Tuesday night in early September. Richard had just ended things with a woman named Jessica, a corporate lawyer he'd been seeing for 3 months. She was smart, ambitious, everything he thought he wanted. But their last conversation had been the final confirmation of what he'd suspected all along. They'd been at dinner at a French restaurant in Tribeca, the kind of place where the wine list had no prices and the waiters spoke in hushed tones. Jessica had been talking about a partnership opportunity at her firm, and then, almost casually, she'd mentioned that it would be helpful to have Richard at the firm's holiday party. Not because she wanted him there, but because his presence would impress her colleagues. She'd said it so matter-of-factly, as if his purpose in her life was purely ornamental. Richard had felt something inside him shut down. He'd paid the bill, walked her to a cab, and told her he didn't think they should see each other anymore. She'd looked surprised, then annoyed, then she'd shrugged and said she understood. And that was it. No fight, no tears, no real emotion at all. Because she hadn't really known him. None of them ever had. That night, Richard sat alone in his penthouse with a glass of whiskey he wasn't even drinking. His assistant, a sharp woman in her 50s named Karen, had left a stack of documents on his desk, but he couldn't bring himself to look at them. Instead, he stared out at the city lights, at the millions of people living their lives below, and felt completely disconnected from all of it. The penthouse was massive, Over 3,000 square feet of gleaming hardwood floors and floor-to-ceiling windows, but it felt like a mausoleum. Empty. Cold. A monument to a life that looked perfect from the outside, but felt hollow on the inside. Karen had worked with him for over a decade, and she knew him better than most people in his life. She'd seen him through multiple relationships, watched them all fall apart in the same predictable ways, and she'd never said much about it. But the next morning, when she came into his office and saw the untouched whiskey glass still sitting on the table, she didn't say anything at first. She just poured him a coffee and set it down in front of him. Then she looked at him, really looked at him, and said something that stayed with him. She said, "Richard, you're one of the most successful men I know, but you're also one of the loneliest. And I think you're afraid that if you strip away everything you've built, there won't be anything left worth loving." He didn't respond, because what could he say? She was right. That fear had been eating at him for years, the fear that his worth was tied entirely to his bank account, that without it, he was invisible, worthless, forgettable. And the more he thought about it, the more he realized he had to know the truth. He had to find out if anyone could love him, not for what he had, but for who he was. And the only way to do that was to take everything away. The idea came to him slowly, over the course of several sleepless nights. What if he disappeared? What if he stripped away every marker of wealth, every symbol of status, and became nobody? What if he lived on the streets, experienced the world from the bottom, and saw how people treated him when he had nothing to offer? It was reckless, maybe even self-destructive, but Richard couldn't shake the feeling that he had to do this. He had to know if love, real love, could exist outside the bubble of wealth he'd been living in his entire adult life. So he started planning. He told Karen he was taking a leave of absence, that he needed time away to clear his head. She didn't ask questions, though he could see the concern in her eyes. He withdrew a small amount of cash, enough to survive, but not enough to fall back on if things went wrong. He left his credit cards, his watch, his phone, everything that connected him to his old life, locked away in a safe in his apartment. He donated most of his expensive clothes and bought a few worn-out pieces from a thrift store, jeans with holes in the knees, a faded jacket that smelled like someone else's life, a pair of scuffed boots that pinched his feet. He hadn't worn anything like this since college, and even then, it had been a choice, a phase, not a necessity. Now, staring at himself in the mirror, he barely recognized the man looking back. His hair was longer than usual, a little greasy. His face was unshaven. His posture, once confident and upright, was slouched, guarded, the posture of someone trying not to be noticed. And that was the point. He didn't want to be Richard Blake anymore. He wanted to be nobody. The first night, he slept on a bench in Central Park. It was late September, and the air had that crisp bite to it that warned of winter coming. He lay there with his jacket pulled tight around him, staring up at the sky, and for the first time in years, no one knew where he was. No one was calling him, texting him, expecting anything from him. And instead of feeling free, he felt terrified. The park at night was a different world, filled with sounds he'd never noticed before. The rustle of leaves, the distant wail of sirens, the shuffle of other homeless people finding their spots for the night. Every shadow felt threatening. Every noise made his heart race. He'd read about homelessness, seen it from the windows of his chauffeured car, but he'd never understood the visceral fear that came with being completely vulnerable, completely exposed. By the second day, he realized just how invisible poverty made you. He walked through the same neighborhoods he used to frequent, past the coffee shop where he'd get his morning espresso, past the corner where he'd hail cabs without a second thought. But now, dressed in his thrift store clothes, no one looked at him. People stepped around him like he was an obstacle, a shadow, something to be avoided. When he sat down on a street corner with a paper cup in front of him, the invisibility became even sharper. Hundreds of people passed by, and maybe 1 in 50 made eye contact. Most looked right through him, as if he didn't exist. And the ones who did notice him looked at him with pity, with disgust, with suspicion, but never with curiosity, never with kindness. It was a humiliation he hadn't prepared for, and it shook him to his core. For the first time in his life, no one cared who he was, and he wasn't sure if that was freedom or the loneliest thing he'd ever felt. The physical reality of life on the streets hit him harder than he'd expected. By the third day, his body ached in ways he'd never experienced. His back throbbed from sleeping on hard surfaces. His feet were blistered from walking in ill-fitting boots. His stomach cramped from hunger because he couldn't bring himself to beg aggressively enough to get more than a few dollars a day. He'd thought he understood poverty intellectually, but the physical toll was something entirely different. The cold seeped into his bones at night. The hunger made it hard to think clearly. The constant vigilance, always watching for danger, always protecting the few belongings he had, was exhausting. And the shame was overwhelming. Every time someone walked past without acknowledging him, every time someone crossed the street to avoid him, every time he saw disgust in someone's eyes, he felt a piece of his dignity stripped away. He began to understand why so many homeless people seemed defeated, why their eyes looked empty. It wasn't just about lacking money. It was about being treated as if you didn't matter, as if your existence was an inconvenience to everyone around you. And that kind of daily humiliation broke something inside you. Days turned into weeks, and Richard began to understand the mechanics of survival on the streets in a way he never had before. He learned where the shelters were, which ones had long lines, and which ones closed early. He learned which restaurants threw out food at the end of the night, and which dumpsters were worth checking. He learned to recognize the other people living on the margins, the ones who, like him, had become invisible to the world. Some were addicts, their bodies ravaged by drugs, their minds fractured by years of abuse. Some were mentally ill, talking to voices only they could hear, their reality so different from everyone else's that communication was nearly impossible. Some were veterans, men who'd served their country only to come home to a system that didn't know how to help them. And some were just unlucky, one bad month, one missed paycheck, one medical bill that cascaded into eviction and then into homelessness. And the more he talked to them, the more he realized how thin the line was between success and desperation, how quickly everything could fall apart. He met a man named Tommy, a former electrician who'd lost his job when his company went under, then lost his apartment when he couldn't pay rent, then lost custody of his kids when he couldn't provide a stable home. Tommy was 52, articulate, skilled, and completely defeated. He told Richard that the hardest part wasn't the hunger or the cold, it was the way people looked at him, as if his homelessness was a moral failing rather than a series of unfortunate circumstances. Richard listened to these stories, and each one carved away at the assumptions he'd carried his entire life. But what surprised him most was how people treated him. Younger people, especially women in their 20s and 30s, avoided him entirely. They'd cross the street, clutch their purses tighter, refuse to make eye contact. When he did manage to catch someone's eye, he could see the fear, the judgment, the assumption that he was dangerous or unstable. It stung, but he understood it. He had been one of them once, too busy, too self-important, too afraid to acknowledge the discomfort of seeing someone struggling. But older women, women in their 50s and 60s, were different. They were the ones who stopped, who offered $1, a sandwich, a kind word, who looked him in the eye and treated him like a human being. One woman, with silver hair and a soft smile, stopped in front of him one morning and handed him a breakfast sandwich from a deli. She didn't say much, just, "It's cold out here. You should eat." And then she walked away. It was such a small gesture, but it broke something open inside him. Because it reminded him that kindness still existed, even in a world that had trained people to look away. Another woman, probably in her early 60s, stopped and asked if he needed socks. When he nodded, she went into a nearby pharmacy, bought 3 pairs of thermal socks, and brought them back to him. She said her son had been homeless for 2 years before he got back on his feet, and she knew how much the small things mattered. Richard thanked her, his voice thick with emotion, and she squeezed his shoulder before walking away. These moments, these brief flashes of humanity, were what kept him going. They reminded him why he was doing this, why he needed to know if genuine connection was possible. Then, one evening in late October, she appeared. Richard had set up his usual spot near Washington Square Park, a place where foot traffic was steady but not overwhelming. The air was sharp and cold, and the streetlights had just started to flicker on, casting long shadows across the pavement. He was sitting against a brick wall, his cup in front of him with maybe $3 in loose change, his head down, when he noticed a pair of shoes stop in front of him. Not expensive shoes, just simple black flats, worn at the edges, the kind of practical shoes someone in the medical field might wear. He looked up, and there she was. A woman, probably in her early 50s, with soft brown hair pulled back into a low ponytail and a face that was kind but guarded. She had the look of someone who'd seen a lot of pain, who'd carried a lot of weight, but hadn't let it make her hard. She wasn't looking at him with pity or judgment. She was just looking at him, like he was a person, not a problem. She crouched down so they were at eye level, and she asked, "Are you hungry?" Her voice was gentle, but there was a directness to it, a practicality that suggested she was used to dealing with difficult situations. He nodded, not trusting himself to speak. She reached into her bag and pulled out a granola bar and a bottle of water. "Here," she said. "It's not much, but it's something." He took them, his hands shaking slightly from the cold, and managed to say, "Thank you." She nodded, stood up, and started to walk away. But then she paused, looked back at him, and said, "What's your name?" He hesitated, his mind racing. He couldn't tell her his real name. Not yet, maybe not ever. So he said the first name that came to mind. "David." She smiled, just a little. "I'm Claire." And then she was gone, disappearing into the evening crowd. But here's the thing, Claire came back. Not every day, but a few times a week. She'd stop by his corner, sometimes with food, sometimes with coffee, sometimes just to sit for a few minutes and talk. And she never asked the questions he expected. She never asked why he was homeless, how he ended up there, what mistakes he'd made. She just talked to him like a person, like someone whose thoughts and opinions mattered. She told him about her job as a nurse at a nearby hospital, about how exhausting the 12-hour shifts were, how much she loved her patients, but how draining it was to carry their pain. She talked about the elderly woman in room 304 who had no family and spent her days staring out the window, waiting for visitors who never came. She talked about the young man who'd overdosed 3 times in the past month and kept ending up back in the emergency room because no one could get him into a rehab program. She talked about the bureaucracy, the insurance companies that denied coverage, the families torn apart by medical debt. And Richard listened, really listened, in a way he hadn't listened to anyone in years. Because Claire wasn't performing for him, wasn't trying to impress him or get something from him. She was just being herself, honest and raw and real. She told him about her daughter, Emily, who was 28 and lived upstate in Albany, working as a teacher. Emily called once a week, usually on Sunday evenings, and they'd talk for about 20 minutes before Emily would say she had papers to grade or lesson plans to prepare. Claire never said it directly, but Richard could hear the loneliness in her voice when she talked about her daughter. The subtle disappointment that Emily rarely visited, that their relationship had become cordial but distant, that somewhere along the way they'd lost the closeness they'd had when Emily was younger. Claire didn't blame her. She understood that Emily had her own life, her own struggles, but it hurt nonetheless. Richard understood that kind of loneliness, the kind that existed even when you had people in your life, because those people didn't really see you. And then Claire told him about her late husband, Michael, who had died 5 years earlier from pancreatic cancer. She said he'd been diagnosed in March and was gone by August, 5 months that felt like both an eternity and no time at all. She described sitting by his hospital bed, watching him fade a little more each day, holding his hand as he took his last breath. And she said that some days the grief still hit her out of nowhere, like a wave she wasn't prepared for. She'd be walking down the street or cooking dinner or brushing her teeth, and suddenly she'd remember something he used to do, the way he'd hum while making coffee, or the way he'd call her Claire Bear when he wanted to make her smile, and the loss would feel fresh all over again. Richard, or David, as she knew him, listened to all of this with a kind of attention he hadn't given anyone in years. And slowly, carefully, he started to share pieces of himself too. Not the truth, not yet, but pieces that felt real. He told her about feeling invisible, about wondering if anyone would care if he disappeared. He told her about the loneliness of being surrounded by people who didn't really see you, who only saw what they wanted from you. He didn't tell her about the money, the business, the penthouse, but the emotions he shared were genuine. The isolation, the exhaustion, the quiet desperation of feeling fundamentally alone. And Claire understood. She didn't try to fix him or offer empty reassurances. She just nodded and said, "I know what that's like." And in those moments, sitting on the cold pavement with the city rushing past them, Richard felt something he hadn't felt in years. Connection. Real, genuine, human connection. The kind that had nothing to do with money or status or what either of them could offer the other. It was just two people, both carrying their own pain, finding a moment of understanding in each other's presence. Over the weeks, something shifted between them. It wasn't romance, not yet. It was something quieter, more fragile. It was the beginnings of trust. Claire started staying longer when she visited. Sometimes she'd sit with him for half an hour, sometimes an hour. She brought him things he needed, not just food, but a warm blanket, a pair of gloves, a beanie to keep his head warm as the weather got colder. She never made a big deal about it, never acted like she was doing him some great favor. She'd just hand him whatever she'd brought and say something like, "Thought you might need this," and then they'd continue their conversation as if nothing had happened. Richard found himself looking forward to her visits in a way that surprised him. In his old life, he'd been surrounded by people constantly, at work, at social events, at dinners and parties, but he'd felt alone in all of it. Now, sitting on a street corner with nothing but the clothes on his back, he felt less alone than he had in years. Because Claire saw him. Not Richard Blake, the successful businessman, but David, the homeless man who listened when she talked and shared his own struggles in return. She saw him as a human being, worthy of kindness and respect, and that meant more than any of the admiration or envy he'd received in his former life. One night, sitting on the cold pavement with their backs against the wall, Claire told him something she said she'd never told anyone before. Her voice was quiet, almost hesitant, and Richard could tell that whatever she was about to share cost her something to say out loud. She said that after Michael died, she'd thought about ending her life. Not in a dramatic way, she clarified, not with some grand gesture or plan, but in a quiet, tired way. She was exhausted from grief, from loneliness, from feeling like no one needed her anymore. Her daughter was grown and living her own life. Her husband was gone. Her parents had passed years earlier, and she'd found herself wondering what the point was. Why keep going when the best parts of life seemed to be behind her? She'd had the thought more than once, usually late at night, when the house felt too big and too empty, when the silence pressed in on her and she couldn't shake the feeling that her life had become small and meaningless. But she didn't do it, she continued, because one of her patients, an elderly man with dementia named Mr. Peterson, had held her hand one day and said, "You have kind eyes." He probably forgot saying it 5 minutes later. His memory was almost completely gone, but those 4 words had lodged themselves in Claire's heart. And for some reason, that tiny moment of being seen, of being recognized as someone who mattered, was enough. That one simple observation from a man who barely knew where he was had reminded her that her presence in the world had value, that the kindness she gave to others made a difference, even if it was just for a moment. And so she'd kept going, kept showing up for her shifts, kept putting one foot in front of the other, because maybe someone else would need her kind eyes. Richard felt his throat tighten as she spoke. He reached over without thinking and took her hand, and for a long time, they just sat there in silence, their fingers interlaced, neither of them needing to say anything more. The city moved around them, people rushing past with their own worries and destinations, but in that moment, the world narrowed down to just the two of them. And Richard realized something terrifying. He was falling in love with her. Not the superficial attraction he'd felt in his past relationships, not the excitement of someone new or the thrill of being wanted. This was different. This was deeper. He was falling in love with Claire because of who she was, because of her kindness and her honesty and her quiet strength, because she'd chosen to see him when he had nothing to offer, because she'd shared her pain with him and trusted him with her darkest moments. And the realization filled him with both joy and dread, because the lie he was living had just become dangerous. Every moment he spent with her was built on deception. She thought she knew him, thought she understood who he was. But she was falling for a fiction, and the longer it went on, the harder it would be to tell the truth. But he couldn't bring himself to stop. Not yet. Because these moments with Claire were the most real thing in his life, and he wasn't ready to let them go. The guilt started to eat at him. It began as a small, nagging feeling in the back of his mind, easy to push away or rationalize. He told himself that his feelings were genuine, that the person he was with Claire was the real him, just without the money. But as the weeks went on and their connection deepened, the guilt grew heavier, harder to ignore. Every time Claire showed up, every time she smiled at him, every time she treated him with dignity and kindness, Richard felt the weight of his deception pressing down on him like a stone. She had opened her heart to him, trusted him with her pain, her past, her vulnerability. And he was lying to her. Every single day, he was letting her believe he was someone he wasn't, and that betrayal felt worse than anything he'd experienced in his past relationships. Because this time, he was the one doing the hurting. He was the one manipulating the situation, testing her without her knowledge or consent. And no matter how much he tried to justify it, no matter how many times he told himself he was searching for truth, he couldn't escape the fact that what he was doing was fundamentally dishonest. He started having conversations with himself late at night, lying on whatever bench or doorway he'd found for shelter. He'd replay moments with Claire, analyzing every word, every gesture, trying to convince himself that she truly cared about him, that it wasn't just pity or some misguided sense of charity. But then another voice in his head would ask the harder question: even if she does care about David, the homeless man, will she care about Richard, the billionaire who lied to her? Will she be able to forgive the deception, or will she see it for what it really is, a manipulation, a test she never agreed to take? He didn't have answers to these questions, and that uncertainty terrified him. Because the truth was, he'd found exactly what he'd been looking for. Claire had proven that love without money was possible. She'd chosen to spend time with him, to care about him, to share herself with him when he had absolutely nothing to offer materially. She'd passed his test with flying colors. But in doing so, he'd created a new problem. The love he was searching for had arrived, but it was built on a foundation of lies. And he didn't know if it could survive the truth. The weather was getting colder now, late October sliding into early November, and the nights were becoming harder to endure. Richard's body was showing the strain of 2 months on the streets. He'd lost weight, his clothes hanging looser on his frame. His hands were chapped and cracked from the cold. He had a persistent cough that wouldn't go away. He'd developed an infection in his left foot from a blister that had gotten worse, and he was limping now, trying to keep weight off it. The physical deterioration was alarming, and part of him knew he couldn't keep this up much longer. But every time he thought about ending the experiment, about going back to his old life, he thought about Claire. And he couldn't bear the idea of just disappearing, of her showing up one day to find him gone without explanation. She deserved better than that. She deserved the truth. But giving her the truth meant risking everything they'd built together, and he didn't know if he was brave enough to do that. One evening in early November, Claire brought him a thermos of hot soup and sat down beside him, closer than usual. It was freezing, the first real cold snap of the season, and their breath came out in small clouds that dissipated quickly in the night air. She looked at him for a long moment, her eyes searching his face, and Richard felt exposed, as if she could see right through him. Then she said, "David, can I ask you something?" He nodded, his heart pounding, wondering if somehow she'd figured it out, if the lie was about to unravel right here, right now. She said, "Do you ever think about what comes next? Like, do you ever imagine a life where things are different? Where you're not sitting on this corner every night? Where you have a home, a job, a future?" Richard didn't know how to answer that. Because of course he thought about what came next, but his version of what came next was completely different from what she was imagining. So he just said, "Every day? I think about it every day." She smiled, a sad, hopeful kind of smile that made his chest ache. "Me too," she said. And then, quietly, she added, "I think you're stronger than you know, David. I think you're capable of so much more than you realize. And I hope that one day you'll see that in yourself." Richard felt something crack inside him. Because she believed in him, in a version of him that didn't even exist. She saw potential in David, the homeless man, not knowing that Richard, the billionaire, was sitting right in front of her. And he didn't know how to carry that anymore. The weight of her belief, her kindness, her trust, it was crushing him. He wanted to tell her everything right then, wanted to confess the whole elaborate deception and beg for her forgiveness. But fear stopped him cold, the same fear that had been stopping him for weeks. What if she hated him? What if she felt used, manipulated, betrayed? What if she walked away and he lost the one person who had made him feel human again? So he stayed silent, swallowing the words that burned in his throat, and instead he took her hand and held it tightly. And Claire, mistaking his silence for emotion about his circumstances, squeezed back and said, "It's okay. Whatever happens, you're going to be okay." But Richard wasn't sure that was true anymore. By mid-November, Richard had been living on the streets for nearly 2 months, and he knew he couldn't keep this up much longer. The cold was getting worse, his body was wearing down, and the lie was suffocating him. Every interaction with Claire felt like walking on a knife's edge, trying to be honest about his feelings while hiding the fundamental truth of who he was. He'd started making mistakes, small slips that he had to quickly cover. Once, he'd used a word, liquidate, in a way that didn't quite fit with his homeless persona, and Claire had given him a curious look. Another time, he'd commented on the stock market, something he'd seen on a newspaper someone had left behind, but his analysis had been too detailed, too informed. Claire had noticed that too, had said something like, "You're smarter than you give yourself credit for," and he'd had to deflect, make some joke about reading too much discarded business section. Each slip made him more paranoid, more aware that the fiction he was maintaining was fragile and could shatter at any moment. But more than the fear of being discovered, Richard was grappling with a deeper realization. He had come into this experiment with a clear question: could someone love him without his money? And he'd gotten his answer. Yes, absolutely yes. Claire had shown him kindness, respect, and genuine care without knowing anything about his wealth. She had chosen to see him, to spend time with him, to share herself with him when he had nothing material to offer. That question had been answered definitively. But in finding that answer, he'd stumbled onto a much harder truth. Real love, the kind he'd been searching for, required honesty. It required vulnerability and trust, and the courage to be fully seen, flaws and all. And by building this connection on a lie, he'd undermined the very thing he was trying to find. The love Claire felt for him was real, he believed that. But it was love for a person who didn't fully exist. She loved David, the struggling homeless man trying to survive on the streets. But would she love Richard, the wealthy businessman who'd lied to her for months? Would she be able to forgive the deception, or would it poison everything they'd shared? These questions haunted him constantly now, circling through his mind in endless loops. He'd replay conversations with Claire, looking for clues about how she might react. He remembered her talking about Michael, about how much she'd valued his honesty, how she'd said one of the things she loved most about him was that he never played games, never hid his feelings or pretended to be someone he wasn't. He remembered her talking about a friend who'd lied about something significant, Richard couldn't remember what, and how that lie had ended their friendship permanently. Claire had said she could forgive a lot of things, mistakes, failures, even betrayal in some forms, but lying was different. Lying was a choice to actively deceive, and that broke something fundamental in a relationship. These memories didn't comfort Richard. They terrified him. Because he was lying to her, had been lying to her since the moment they met, and he had no idea if their connection was strong enough to survive the truth. If you're still watching at this point, drop a comment with, "I'm still here." Let's see who's truly following this shocking story. One night in mid-November, something happened that forced Richard's hand. He was in his usual spot near Washington Square Park when a group of college kids walked by, clearly drunk, laughing too loud and stumbling over each other. Richard kept his head down, hoping they'd just pass by like everyone else. But one of them, a young man in a fraternity sweatshirt, decided he was entertainment. He stopped in front of Richard and said something crude, something about how Richard should get a job instead of begging. His friends laughed, egging him on. The young man pulled out his phone, started recording, making a video for social media. He was asking Richard questions, mocking him, treating him like a spectacle rather than a person. Richard tried to ignore him, tried to stay calm, but the young man got more aggressive. He kicked Richard's cup, scattering the few dollars inside across the pavement. And then he did something that made Richard's blood run cold. He grabbed Richard's jacket, trying to pull him up, saying they should see what this homeless guy looked like on his feet. Richard jerked away, and in the scuffle, the young man stumbled backward. His friends thought it was hilarious, but Richard felt something he hadn't felt in months. Rage. Pure, burning rage. Not at the disrespect. He'd experienced plenty of that over the past 2 months, but at the helplessness. At the fact that he had no recourse, no way to defend himself, because defending himself meant revealing who he really was. That's when Claire appeared. She'd been walking by on her way home from a late shift, and she'd seen what was happening. And without hesitation, without fear, she stepped between Richard and the college kids. Her voice was sharp and commanding in a way he'd never heard before. She told them to leave, told them they should be ashamed of themselves, told them that if they didn't walk away immediately she'd call the police and press charges for harassment and assault. The young man tried to laugh it off, tried to say they were just having fun, But Claire didn't back down. She stood her ground, her phone already out, already dialing. And finally, sensing that she was serious, the group moved on, laughing nervously and calling back insults that tried to save face. When they were gone, Claire turned to Richard, her face flushed with anger and concern. She crouched down next to him and asked if he was okay, if they'd hurt him. Richard nodded, too shaken to speak. And then Claire did something that broke him completely. She started picking up the scattered dollars, gathering them carefully and putting them back in his cup. And she was crying. Not loud, dramatic crying, but quiet tears that streamed down her face as she worked. When she was done, she sat down next to him, right there on the cold pavement, and she said, "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry that happened to you. No one deserves to be treated like that. No one." Richard couldn't hold it together anymore. He started crying too, months of suppressed emotion finally breaking through. And Claire put her arm around him, holding him while he shook with sobs, and she didn't ask questions or demand explanations. She just held him, her presence steady and solid and real. And in that moment, Richard knew he couldn't do this anymore. He couldn't keep lying to this woman who had just defended him, who was sitting on a filthy sidewalk holding him while he cried, who had shown him more genuine love and care than anyone in his entire privileged life. She deserved the truth. Even if it meant losing her, even if it meant facing her anger and disappointment, she deserved to know who he really was. So when they'd both calmed down, when the tears had stopped and the night had grown quiet around them, Richard took a deep breath and said, "Claire, there's something I need to tell you. Something important. Can we talk tomorrow? Somewhere private?" She looked at him, concern still etched on her face, and nodded. "Of course," she said. "Whatever you need." They agreed to meet the next evening at a small diner a few blocks away, a place that was warm and relatively quiet. And as Claire walked away, Richard felt a strange mix of terror and relief. The lie was coming to an end. And whatever happened next, at least it would be real. That night, Richard barely slept. He'd found a shelter bed for once, too exhausted and shaken from the encounter with the college kids to spend another night outside, but sleep wouldn't come. He lay on the thin mattress, staring at the ceiling, listening to the sounds of dozens of other people around him, snoring, coughing, shifting restlessly. And he thought about what he would say to Claire. How do you confess something like this? How do you tell someone that everything they thought they knew about you was carefully constructed fiction? He ran through different versions in his mind, different ways to explain, different appeals for understanding. But none of them felt adequate. None of them changed the fundamental fact that he had lied to her, manipulated her, tested her without her consent. By the time morning came, Richard had made a decision. He wouldn't try to justify what he'd done or make excuses. He would simply tell her the truth, all of it, and let her decide what it meant. She deserved that much. She deserved his honesty, even if it was 2 months too late. He spent the day in a kind of daze, going through the motions of his homeless routine, but feeling disconnected from all of it. He knew this would probably be his last day living like this, regardless of how things went with Claire. If she forgave him, he'd have to come clean about everything and return to his real life. If she didn't forgive him, there would be no point in continuing the experiment. The question he'd set out to answer had been answered, and continuing to live on the streets would just be self-punishment at that point. So he said quiet goodbyes to some of the people he'd gotten to know over the past 2 months. Tommy, the former electrician, who shook his hand and told him to take care of himself. Maria, an older woman who'd been homeless for 5 years and always shared whatever food she managed to get. She gave him a worn rosary and told him to keep it for luck. He didn't tell any of them the truth about who he was. That felt like yet another betrayal. But he thanked them for their kindness and their friendship. And then, as evening approached, he made his way to the diner. Claire was already there, sitting in a booth by the window. When she saw him, she waved, and Richard felt his heart clench. She looked tired, probably from working a long shift, but she smiled at him with that same warmth she'd always shown. He slid into the booth across from her, his hands shaking under the table. A waitress came over and Claire ordered coffee for both of them. When the waitress left, Claire reached across the table and touched his hand. "You look terrified," she said gently. "Whatever it is, you can tell me. I'm not going to judge you." Richard almost laughed at that, because judgment was exactly what he deserved. But he just nodded and took a deep breath. And then he started talking. He told her everything. He started from the beginning, from his life as Richard Blake, from the loneliness that had eaten away at him despite all his success, from the endless cycle of relationships that never felt real. He told her about the night he'd decided to do this, to strip away everything and see if anyone could love him for who he was rather than what he had. He told her about the planning, the preparation, the terror of that first night on the streets. He told her about the past 2 months, about everything he'd learned and experienced. And then he told her about meeting her, about how she'd been the answer to his question, how she'd shown him kindness and humanity when he had nothing to offer. He told her that he hadn't expected to fall in love with her, that it had happened slowly and then all at once, and that the more he'd fallen for her, the harder it had become to keep lying. He told her he wasn't proud of what he'd done, that he knew it was wrong, that he'd been desperate and reckless and selfish. He told her that she had every right to be angry, to hate him, to walk away and never speak to him again. And then he told her the hardest part. He told her that he'd fallen in love with her, truly, deeply, completely. That she had shown him a kind of love he didn't know existed, and that whether she could ever forgive him or not, he wanted her to know that his feelings were real, that the person he'd been with her, the vulnerability, the honesty about his emotions, that had all been genuine. The only lie had been his circumstances, but the connection they'd shared was the realest thing in his life. When he finished, the silence was unbearable. Claire sat there, staring down at her hands, which were clasped tightly on the table. Her face was unreadable, a carefully controlled blankness that terrified Richard more than anger would have. The coffee the waitress had brought sat untouched between them, steam rising slowly into the air. Richard waited, his heart pounding so hard he thought it might break through his chest. He could hear everything around them with painful clarity, the clatter of dishes in the kitchen, the murmur of conversation from other tables, the tick of the clock on the wall. Each second felt like an eternity. Finally, after what felt like hours but was probably only a few minutes, Claire looked up at him. Her eyes were wet, but her voice was steady. She said, "I'm hurt, David. Or Richard. Or whoever you are. I'm hurt because I trusted you. I told you things I've never told anyone. I shared parts of myself I keep hidden from everyone else. And the whole time, you were lying to me. The whole time, this was some kind of experiment, some kind of test I didn't even know I was taking." Richard nodded, because she was absolutely right. He wanted to interrupt, to explain, to somehow make it better, but he forced himself to stay quiet. She deserved to say everything she needed to say without him trying to defend himself. Claire continued, her voice getting stronger, more certain. "But I'm also trying to understand why you did it. And I think I do, at least a little. You were looking for something real. Something that wasn't about money or status. And I get that. I understand that kind of loneliness, that fear that no one really sees you. But here's the thing, Richard. Love isn't real if it's built on deception. You can't test someone's feelings by lying to them. That's not love. That's control. That's manipulation. You took away my ability to make an informed choice about who I was getting close to. You decided that your need to know the truth was more important than my right to the truth. And that's not okay. That's not love." Each word landed like a blow, and Richard felt them physically, felt the weight of his mistakes settling over him like a heavy blanket. She was right. About all of it. He'd told himself he was searching for truth, but he'd done it by lying. He'd wanted genuine connection, but he'd built it on false pretenses. He'd been so focused on his own pain, his own need to know, that he hadn't fully considered what it would mean for Claire to be part of his experiment without her knowledge. He opened his mouth to respond, but Claire wasn't done. She said, "And the worst part is, the person I got to know over these past 2 months, the person I cared about, I don't even know if he's real. Was any of it real? Or was it all just performance? Just you playing a role to see how I'd react? How am I supposed to know what was genuine and what was manipulation?" Richard felt tears prick his eyes. That question cut deeper than anything else, because it was the question he'd been asking himself for weeks. And the truth was complicated. So he said, "The circumstances were a lie. My name, my situation, all of that was false. But my feelings were real. The conversations we had, the connection we shared, that was real. The person you got to know, that was me. Maybe the most honest version of myself I've ever been. I wasn't performing, Claire. I was just finally letting myself be seen without all the armor I usually wear." Claire shook her head slowly. "But that's the problem, Richard. You can't separate the two that easily. Your circumstances are part of who you are. Your wealth, your privilege, Your ability to walk away from this experiment whenever you wanted. Those things shape you. They affect how you move through the world, how you think, what choices you have available to you. The David I knew didn't have any of that. So in a way, yes, you were performing. You were performing poverty, performing vulnerability, performing powerlessness. And that's insulting, not just to me, but to everyone who lives that reality every day without the luxury of a safety net. Richard felt the truth of that statement like a physical blow. He'd been so focused on his own emotional journey, his own need for validation, that he hadn't fully grappled with the ethical implications of what he was doing. He'd been playing at poverty, treating it like a costume he could put on and take off, while people like Tommy, like Maria, like countless others he'd met, were trapped in it with no escape. And Claire, who worked with struggling patients every day, who saw real suffering and real desperation, had every right to be offended by his charade. "I know," he said quietly. "You're right. About all of it. I was selfish. I was thoughtless. I didn't consider how this would affect you, and I didn't think about the deeper implications of what I was doing. I just knew I was lonely and desperate, and I made a reckless decision that hurt people. I'm sorry. I know that doesn't fix anything, but I am truly sorry." Claire was quiet for a long moment, staring at him with an expression he couldn't quite read. Then she said, "I need time to think about this. I need space. This is a lot to process, and I can't give you an answer right now about what this means or whether there's any path forward." And Richard nodded, because what else could he do? "I understand," he said. "Take all the time you need. And Claire, thank you. For listening. For not just walking out immediately. For giving me the chance to tell you the truth, even though I don't deserve it." Claire's expression softened slightly. "You're right that you don't deserve it," she said. "But I'm giving it to you anyway. Not because of anything you did, but because of who I choose to be. I choose to listen. I choose to try to understand. But that doesn't mean I'm choosing to forgive, at least not yet. I don't know if I can." And Richard nodded again, understanding the distinction. She stood up then, putting money on the table for the coffee neither of them had touched. "I'll call you," she said. "Or I won't. But either way, you need to respect my decision." He stood as well. "I will," he promised. "Whatever you decide, I'll respect it." And then she walked out of the diner, and Richard was left standing there, feeling more alone than he had during any night on the streets. The next 2 weeks were the longest of Richard's life. He moved back into his apartment, slowly reintegrating into his old world, but everything felt hollow now. The penthouse that had once been his pride felt like a prison, all that space and luxury and nothing filling it. He tried to focus on work, to catch up on everything he'd missed during his 2-month absence, but he couldn't concentrate. Karen, his assistant, noticed immediately that something was wrong. She didn't pry, but she made sure he ate, made sure he attended the most important meetings, quietly managed things so his absence wouldn't be noticed by clients or partners. She was protective in a way that touched him, and one day he thanked her for it. She just looked at him with those knowing eyes and said, "I hope you found what you were looking for." He didn't know how to answer that. Because he had found what he was looking for, he'd found proof that love without money was possible. He'd found a woman who'd shown him genuine kindness and connection. But he'd also found something he wasn't looking for, the crushing weight of guilt, the knowledge that his search for truth had been built on deception, the realization that the thing he wanted most might be lost because of how he'd tried to find it. He didn't hear from Claire. Not for days, then a week, then 2 weeks. Every time his phone rang, his heart would jump, hoping it was her. But it never was. He thought about calling her 100 times, picking up the phone and then putting it down, respecting her request for space even though it was killing him. He drove by the hospital where she worked a few times, not to confront her or pressure her, but just to be near a place that was important to her, to feel some connection to her even from a distance. He went back to Washington Square Park once, sat on the bench where he used to set up his spot, and watched the world go by. He saw other homeless people, people he'd sat beside and talked with, and he felt a profound sense of shame that he'd left without really helping any of them. He'd learned from them, had used their reality to search for his own answers, and then he'd simply walked away back into his privileged life. So he started making donations, anonymously, to shelters and programs that helped homeless individuals. It wasn't enough, it could never be enough, but it was something. A small way of acknowledging the debt he owed to people who'd shown him humanity when he pretended to need it. On the 14th day after their conversation at the diner, Richard's phone finally rang with an unfamiliar number. His hands shook as he answered. Hello? There was a pause, then Claire's voice, calm but cautious. Richard? It's Claire. Can we meet? He said yes immediately, trying to keep the desperation out of his voice. When? Where? The same diner, she said. Tomorrow evening. 6 o'clock. He agreed, and then she hung up. Richard spent the next 24 hours in a state of anxious anticipation, unable to eat, unable to sleep, running through every possible scenario in his mind. She might want to tell him to never contact her again. She might want closure. She might want to give him one more piece of her mind about how he'd betrayed her trust. He tried to prepare himself for rejection, tried to tell himself that whatever she decided, he would accept it gracefully. But the truth was, he wasn't prepared at all. Because somewhere in the past 2 months, Claire had become essential to him, and the thought of losing her permanently was almost unbearable. The next evening, Richard arrived at the diner 15 minutes early. He debated what to wear, finally settling on simple jeans and a sweater, nothing too flashy or expensive. He wanted to look like himself, but not like he was trying to impress her or show off his wealth. When Claire arrived, right at 6, his heart clenched. She looked tired, like she hadn't been sleeping well either, but there was a clarity in her eyes that hadn't been there at their last meeting. She slid into the booth across from him, and they both ordered coffee from the waitress, falling into the familiar pattern without thinking about it. For a moment, they just looked at each other, and Richard could see her taking him in, seeing him as he really was for the first time. Not David, the homeless man in worn-out clothes, but Richard, the billionaire sitting across from her in a clean sweater and jeans that probably cost more than she made in a week. He wondered what she was thinking, if she could reconcile these two versions of the same person, or if they seemed like completely different people to her. Finally, Claire spoke. I've spent the last 2 weeks trying to figure out if I can forgive you, she said, and I still don't have a clear answer. Part of me is angry. Part of me feels used. Part of me feels stupid for not seeing through your act. But there's another part of me that understands why you did it, at least a little. And that part keeps reminding me that the connection we had felt real. The conversations, the moments of understanding, the way you listened to me, all of that felt genuine. And I've been trying to figure out if that's enough. Richard stayed quiet, letting her work through her thoughts out loud. She continued, I talked to my therapist about it. Yes, I have a therapist, she added with a slight smile. Most people in healthcare do. And she asked me a question that I've been thinking about ever since. She asked me if I thought you were a fundamentally good person who made a bad choice, or a fundamentally bad person who occasionally did good things. And that question has been haunting me. Richard felt the weight of that question, because he'd been asking himself the same thing for weeks. He'd always thought of himself as a good person, ethical, principled, someone who tried to do right by others. But what he'd done to Claire didn't fit that self-image. So which was true? Could one really terrible decision negate a lifetime of trying to be good? Or did it reveal something fundamental about his character, something selfish and manipulative that had always been there beneath the surface? He didn't know, and he suspected Claire didn't know either. So what did you decide? He asked quietly. Claire took a deep breath. I decided that I don't know. I don't think people are that simple. I don't think you're purely good or purely bad. I think you're complicated, like everyone else. I think you were in pain, and you made a choice that hurt someone else in your attempt to heal yourself. And I think you probably didn't fully understand the implications of what you were doing until it was too late to take it back. That sounds about right, Richard admitted. I was so focused on my own loneliness, my own need to know if I was lovable without my money, that I didn't think about what it would mean for you to be part of that without your knowledge or consent. I violated your trust before you even knew me well enough to give it. And that was wrong. Claire nodded. It was wrong, she agreed. But I also think the person I got to know over those 2 months was real. Maybe not complete, maybe not honest about his circumstances, but real in his emotions and his vulnerability. And I can't just throw that away because the wrapper it came in was false. Richard felt a flicker of hope, small and fragile, but there. So what does that mean? He asked. Claire looked at him steadily. It means I'm willing to try. Not to go back to what we had, because that was built on something broken. But to start over. To see if we can build something real this time. Something honest. I'm not promising anything. I'm not saying I forgive you completely, because I'm not sure I do yet. But I'm saying I'm willing to see if there's something here worth salvaging. Richard felt tears sting his eyes, and he didn't try to hide them. Thank you, he said, his voice rough with emotion. "You have no idea what that means to me. I know I don't deserve a second chance, but I promise you, I will spend every day trying to earn it. I will be completely honest with you from this point forward. No more games, no more tests, no more deception. Just the truth, even when it's hard." Claire reached across the table and took his hand, the same gesture she'd made countless times when he'd been pretending to be homeless. But this time it felt different, weighted with new knowledge, new context. "I'm going to hold you to that," she said. "And if you lie to me again, even once, that's it. We're done. I'm not interested in a relationship where I have to constantly question what's real and what's not." Richard nodded emphatically. "I understand. Complete honesty. I promise." And so they started over. Not from the beginning, because you can never really go back to the beginning once trust has been broken, but from a new place. A place of cautious hope and hard-earned understanding. The first few weeks were awkward. They went on proper dates, to restaurants and movies and museums, but there was a tension underlying everything, a careful navigation of new territory. Claire had to adjust to seeing Richard as he really was, wealthy, successful, part of a world she'd never been part of. And Richard had to prove, through actions rather than words, that he was committed to honesty and that his feelings were genuine. They talked a lot, more than they had when Richard was pretending to be homeless, because now they were building something from scratch with full knowledge of who each other really was. Richard told her about his business, about the pressure and the loneliness of success. Claire told him more about her work, about the patients who broke her heart and the ones who gave her hope. They shared their histories, their families, their dreams and fears. And slowly, carefully, they began to rebuild trust. There were hard moments. About a month in, they had their first real fight. Claire had seen an article about Richard's company in the business section of the newspaper, some acquisition or merger he'd been working on, and she'd realized just how wealthy he actually was. She'd known abstractly that he was rich, but seeing the numbers, understanding the scale of his wealth, had triggered something in her. She'd confronted him about it, asking how he could justify spending months playing at poverty when he had that much money, when he could have been using his resources to actually help people instead of using them as props in his personal drama. Richard didn't have a good answer. He admitted that he'd been selfish, that he'd been so consumed with his own emotional needs that he hadn't thought about the broader implications. But he also told her that the experience had changed him, that he was now actively working with organizations that helped homeless individuals, that he'd set up a foundation to fund housing and job training programs. It wasn't enough to erase what he'd done, but it was something. An attempt to take the lesson he'd learned and turn it into something positive. Claire had accepted that explanation, but the tension lingered for a few days. They worked through it, talking late into the night about privilege and responsibility and the ethics of wealth. Richard learned to really listen when Claire challenged him, to not get defensive, to acknowledge when she was right. And Claire learned to see the complexity in Richard, to understand that he was genuinely trying to be better even if he'd made a terrible mistake. Their relationship wasn't easy, but it was real, and that was what both of them had been searching for all along. Around the 3-month mark of their official relationship, Richard took Claire to meet Karen, his assistant. He wanted Claire to meet someone who'd known him for years, someone who could verify that the person he was now wasn't just a performance for her benefit. Karen and Claire hit it off immediately, bonding over their shared exasperation with Richard's tendency to work too much and not take care of himself. Watching them together, Richard felt something settle inside him. These were his people. Karen, who'd seen him through years of loneliness and had never judged him for it. Claire, who'd seen him at his most vulnerable and had chosen to give him another chance. This was what family felt like. Not the polite distance of business relationships, not the transactional nature of his past romances, but genuine connection built on mutual respect and care. About 4 months into their renewed relationship, Claire invited Richard to have dinner with her daughter, Emily. She'd told Emily about Richard, about their complicated beginning and their attempt to build something honest, and Emily had been skeptical. She was protective of her mother, worried that Richard was going to hurt her, and Claire had respected that concern while also asking Emily to give him a chance. The dinner was at a restaurant in Albany, halfway between where Emily lived and where Richard and Claire were based in New York City. Richard was nervous in a way he hadn't been nervous in years, because Emily's opinion mattered. If Claire's daughter couldn't accept him, couldn't forgive what he'd done, It would put a strain on his relationship with Claire that might eventually break it. But he also understood Emily's skepticism and respected it. She was being a good daughter, looking out for her mother, and that was exactly what she should be doing. The dinner started out tense, with Emily asking pointed questions about Richard's intentions, about why Claire should trust him after what he'd done. Richard answered honestly, not trying to justify his actions, but acknowledging them clearly and explaining what he'd learned. He told Emily that he didn't expect her to trust him, that he knew he had to earn that over time, but that he hoped she'd give him the opportunity to try. Something shifted during that conversation. Maybe it was Richard's willingness to be vulnerable, to admit his mistakes without making excuses. Maybe it was the way he looked at Claire, with obvious love and respect. Maybe it was simply that Emily could see how happy her mother was, happier than she'd been in years. Whatever it was, by the end of the dinner, Emily's hostility had softened into cautious acceptance. She told Richard that she'd be watching him, that if he hurt her mother again, she'd make his life hell, but that she could see he was trying. And that was good enough for now. Richard thanked her for her honesty and promised he wouldn't let her down. When they left the restaurant, Claire took his hand and squeezed it tightly, and Richard knew they'd passed an important test. Not the kind of test he'd created in his manipulation, but the kind that happens naturally when you're building a real relationship with someone who has a life and history and people they care about. By the 6-month mark, Richard and Claire had settled into something that felt solid. They'd navigated the initial awkwardness, worked through the hard conversations, integrated each other into their separate lives. Richard had met Claire's friends, other nurses and neighbors, and people from her book club. Claire had attended a few work events with Richard, uncomfortable at first with the wealth and glamour of his world, but gradually finding her footing. They'd established patterns, regular date nights, lazy Sunday mornings at Claire's apartment, phone calls during Claire's breaks at the hospital. They'd also established boundaries, things they'd learned about each other that needed to be respected. Claire needed time alone to decompress after difficult shifts, and Richard had learned not to take it personally when she needed space. Richard sometimes got absorbed in work and forgot to communicate, and Claire had learned to call him out on it directly rather than letting resentment build. They were learning each other, really learning each other, in a way that Richard had never experienced in any of his previous relationships. One evening in early June, Richard took Claire to Central Park, to the bench where he'd slept on his first night as a homeless man. It was a warm evening, the park filled with joggers and families and couples like themselves. They sat on the bench, watching the sun set over the city, and Richard told her the full story of that first night. How terrified he'd been, how alone he'd felt, how he'd questioned whether he'd made a terrible mistake. Claire listened quietly, then said something that surprised him. She said, "I'm glad you did it. Not because I think the deception was okay, because it wasn't, but because I don't think we would have met otherwise. You wouldn't have been in Washington Square Park. I wouldn't have stopped to talk to you. We existed in completely different worlds, and neither of us would have crossed into the others. So as much as I hate the lie, I can't completely hate the circumstance that brought us together." Richard considered that. She was probably right. In his old life, moving through elite circles and exclusive events, he never would have encountered Claire. And Claire, working long shifts at the hospital and going home to her quiet apartment, would never have had reason to enter his world. The deception, as wrong as it was, had created a bridge between two lives that otherwise never would have connected. But maybe that's the lesson, Richard said slowly, working through the thought as he spoke. Maybe the problem wasn't just that I was lonely or that the women I dated were shallow. Maybe the problem was that I'd built a life that only exposed me to a certain type of person. I'd surrounded myself with wealth and status, and then I was surprised when people were attracted to my wealth and status. Maybe instead of testing people, I should have just made different choices about where I spent my time and who I spent it with. Claire smiled. "Look at you, figuring out basic human behavior." Richard laughed. "Better late than never, right?" They sat in comfortable silence for a while, and then Claire said, "So what now?" "What do you mean?" Richard asked. "I mean, where do we go from here?" Claire clarified. "We've spent 6 months rebuilding trust, figuring out if this thing between us is real. And I think it is. I think we've built something solid. So what's next?" Richard turned to face her fully. "What do you want to be next?" Claire thought about it. "I want to keep building," she said. "I want to see where this goes. I want to introduce you to more of my life, and I want to be part of more of yours." I want to stop feeling like we're in this probationary period and start feeling like we're really together, fully committed, facing whatever comes next as partners." Richard felt warmth spread through his chest. "I want that too," he said. "More than anything. I want to build a life with you, Claire. Not the life I had before, where everything was about work and success and trying to prove something, but a real life, with meaning and connection and love." Claire's eyes were bright. "Then let's do that," she said. "Let's stop being so careful and just be together." Richard kissed her then, a long, slow kiss that tasted like promise and possibility. And for the first time since this whole journey began, he felt truly at peace. He'd set out to find love without money, to prove that he was worth loving for who he was rather than what he had. And he'd found it, though not in the way he'd expected. He'd found it through deception and confession, through breaking trust and painstakingly rebuilding it, through facing his worst flaws and his deepest fears. But he'd found it. And now, sitting in Central Park with Claire's hand in his, watching the city lights flicker on as darkness fell, Richard understood something he'd never understood before. Real wealth wasn't about money. It wasn't about success or status or admiration. Real wealth was having someone who stayed. Someone who saw your worst mistakes and chose to work through them rather than walk away. Someone who challenged you and supported you and made you want to be better than you were. Over the following months, Richard and Claire's relationship deepened in ways that felt both profound and ordinary. They had inside jokes and shared routines. They knew each other's coffee orders and bad moods, and the faces they made when they were trying not to laugh. They met each other's extended families, endured awkward holiday dinners, learned to navigate the complex dynamics of blended social circles. Claire got to know Richard's business partners and started understanding the work that consumed so much of his time. Richard got to know Claire's nursing colleagues and started understanding the emotional toll her job took on her. They supported each other through difficult times. When Claire lost a patient she'd been particularly close to, a young woman with cancer who'd fought for 2 years before finally succumbing, Richard held her while she cried and didn't try to fix it or make it better. He just sat with her in her grief, present and solid. When Richard faced a hostile takeover attempt at his company, something that consumed weeks of his life and left him exhausted and stressed, Claire was there. She brought him food when he forgot to eat, made him take breaks when he was working 16-hour days, reminded him that he was more than his business success. They also had joy together, simple, everyday joy that Richard had never really experienced before. Cooking meals together in Claire's modest kitchen, singing badly to old songs on road trips, watching terrible reality TV shows and making fun of the contestants, walking through the city on Sunday mornings with no particular destination in mind. These ordinary moments felt more valuable than any of the extraordinary experiences Richard's wealth could buy, because they were shared with someone he loved, someone who loved him back, and that made all the difference. About a year after they'd started their official relationship, Richard did something he'd been thinking about for months. He sold his penthouse, the 3,000-square-foot monument to his success, the place that had felt like a lonely museum. He let it go. He moved into a smaller apartment, still nice, but more reasonable, in a neighborhood that felt more like a community and less like a collection of millionaires. Claire didn't move in with him. Not yet. They both felt they needed more time before taking that step, but she had a key and a drawer and a presence in the space that made it feel like home in a way the penthouse never had. Richard also made changes to his business. He stepped back from the day-to-day operations, hired a talented CEO to run things, and transitioned into a more advisory role. This freed up his time to focus on the foundation he'd started, the one dedicated to homelessness prevention and support services. He threw himself into this work with the same intensity he'd once applied to making money, but this time it felt meaningful in a different way. He wasn't building wealth for its own sake. He was trying to address a problem he'd witnessed firsthand, trying to make things better for people like Tommy and Maria and all the others he'd met during his 2 months on the streets. Claire worked with him on this, offering insights from her perspective in healthcare, connecting him with resources and organizations she knew from her work. They became a team, partners not just in romance, but in purpose. And Richard realized this was what he'd been missing all along. Not just someone to love, but someone to build something with, someone who shared his desire to make a difference. 18 months into their relationship, on a cold December evening much like the evening they'd first met, Richard took Claire back to Washington Square Park. It was snowing lightly, the first snow of the season, and the park was quiet except for a few hardy souls cutting through on their way home. Richard led Claire to his old spot, the corner where he'd sat with his cup for so many nights, where she'd first stopped and crouched down and asked if he was hungry. "This is where it started," he said, "where you changed everything." Claire smiled, her breath visible in the cold air. "I was just being human," she said. "You would have done the same for anyone." "That's not true," Richard said. "I wouldn't have. Before all this, I would have walked right past. I would have told myself I was too busy, or that it wasn't my problem, or any of a dozen other excuses. But you stopped. You saw a person everyone else was ignoring, and you stopped. And that kindness, that basic human decency, that's what taught me what love really looks like." Claire's eyes were bright, with unshed tears. Richard continued, "I came here looking for proof that someone could love me without my money. And you gave me that proof. But you also taught me something I wasn't expecting to learn. You taught me that love isn't about testing people or proving something. It's about choosing to show up, day after day, even when it's hard. It's about honesty and vulnerability and being brave enough to let someone really see you. And I want to keep doing that with you. For as long as you'll have me." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small box. Claire's hand went to her mouth, her eyes widening. "Richard," she said, her voice shaking. Richard opened the box, revealing a simple ring, elegant but not ostentatious, a sapphire surrounded by small diamonds. "Claire," he said, his own voice unsteady now, "I know I don't deserve you. I know I started this in the worst possible way. But you gave me a second chance, and I've tried every day since to be worthy of that chance. I love you, not because of what you can give me, but because of who you are. You're kind and strong and honest and real. You make me want to be better. You make me see the world differently. And I want to spend the rest of my life loving you, if you'll let me. Will you marry me?" The snow was falling harder now, collecting in Claire's hair, on her eyelashes. She was crying, tears streaming down her face, but she was smiling too, the biggest smile Richard had ever seen on her. She nodded, then found her voice. "Yes," she said. "Yes, of course yes." Richard stood and pulled her into his arms, kissing her while snow swirled around them, and the city hummed with life beyond the park. When they finally pulled apart, Claire held out her hand, and Richard slipped the ring onto her finger. It fit perfectly. They stood there for a while longer, holding each other in the cold, in the spot where their story had begun with a lie and was now continuing with a promise. And Richard thought about the journey that had brought him here, the loneliness, the reckless decision, the deception, the guilt, the confession, the forgiveness, the rebuilding. It had been messy and complicated and painful, but it had also been real. And that made all the difference. They were married 6 months later, in a small ceremony that reflected both of their values. Not the elaborate society wedding that Richard's wealth could have afforded, but an intimate gathering of the people who mattered most to them. Karen was there, crying happy tears and taking far too many photos. Emily was there, walking her mother down the aisle with obvious pride. Tommy was there, cleaned up and sober now, working steadily thanks to the job training program Richard's foundation had connected him with. Maria was there, still struggling but housed now, living in a supportive residence the foundation helped fund. Richard had tracked down as many people from his time on the streets as he could, wanting them to be part of this moment, wanting them to know that they'd mattered, that they'd taught him something essential about humanity. Not all of them could come. Some had moved on. Some were still too deep in their struggles. But the ones who were there brought a weight of reality to the celebration that grounded it in something deeper than just romantic sentiment. The ceremony was held in a community center in the neighborhood where Claire had grown up, a place that meant something to her rather than some expensive venue that would have been impressive but impersonal. Claire wore a simple white dress that she'd found at a boutique in Brooklyn, beautiful but not extravagant. Richard wore a well-tailored suit, elegant but understated. They exchanged vows they'd written themselves, vows that acknowledged their complicated beginning and their commitment to honesty going forward. Richard's vows included an apology, a public acknowledgement that he'd started their relationship with deception and that he would spend the rest of his life making up for that breach of trust. Claire's vows included forgiveness, a statement that while the beginning had been flawed, what they'd built together since then was solid and real and worth celebrating. There wasn't a dry eye in the room. At the reception, which was held in the same community center, Tommy gave a toast that had everyone both laughing and crying. He talked about meeting Richard on the streets, about not knowing who he really was, and then finding out months later that the guy he'd shared stories with over discarded pizza was actually a billionaire. He said, "I was mad at first when I found out. Felt like he'd been slumming, you know? Like my life was some kind of tourist attraction for a rich guy having a crisis. But then Richard came back. Not as David the homeless guy, but as himself. And he apologized. And then he did something about it. He didn't just feel bad and move on. He actually tried to make things better. And that's when I realized that maybe the whole thing, as messed up as it was, maybe it happened for a reason. Because Richard learned something he needed to learn, and now he's using what he learned to help people like me. And he found Claire, who's basically the best person any of us know. So I guess what I'm saying is, sometimes the wrong path leads you to the right place. And I'm grateful that Richard's wrong path led him to a place where he wanted to help. Because it changed my life. It literally saved my life." The room erupted in applause, and Richard had to wipe away tears. Later, when he and Claire had a moment alone, she squeezed his hand and said, "You did good. With Tommy, with the foundation, with all of it. You took something selfish and turned it into something that helps people. That matters." Richard shook his head. "I'm just trying to make up for my mistakes." Claire smiled. "That's called growth, Richard. That's called being human. We all make mistakes. What matters is what we do after." As the evening wore on, Richard found himself watching Claire move through the room, talking to guests, laughing with Emily, hugging her nursing friends. She was radiant, genuinely happy, and knowing that he was part of that happiness filled him with a contentment he'd never known before. This was what he'd been searching for all along, not just someone who loved him, but someone he could build a life with. Someone who challenged him and supported him and made him better. Someone who was his partner in every sense of the word. Later that night, after the reception had ended and they'd said goodbye to the last guests, Richard and Claire stood outside the community center under the streetlights. It was warm, late June, and the city was alive with summer energy. Claire leaned against Richard, tired but happy. "This was perfect," she said. "It was exactly what I wanted." Richard kissed the top of her head. "Me too," he said. And then, because he'd promised himself complete honesty always, he added, "I still feel guilty sometimes." "About how we started. About lying to you." Claire pulled back slightly to look at him. "I know you do," she said. "And that's actually a good thing. It means you understand the weight of what you did. But Richard, you can't carry that guilt forever. At some point, you have to forgive yourself. I've forgiven you. Your actions since then have shown me who you really are. So now you need to let it go and just be present in what we have now." Richard nodded, knowing she was right, but also knowing it would take time. The guilt had become part of him, a reminder to never take shortcuts with truth, to never prioritize his own needs over someone else's dignity. He didn't think he'd ever fully let it go, but maybe that was okay. Maybe carrying a little bit of guilt, a little bit of awareness of his capacity for selfishness, would make him more conscious, more careful, more committed to doing better. They built a life together that was full and rich in ways that had nothing to do with money. They bought a house together eventually, not a mansion, but a comfortable home in a neighborhood where they knew their neighbors. They hosted dinners for friends, game nights that went late into the evening, holiday gatherings that mixed people from all different parts of their lives. Richard's business associates rubbed shoulders with Claire's nursing friends. Tommy and other people from the Foundation's programs sat at the same table as Emily and her teacher friends. Karen traded stories with Maria about dealing with difficult people. It was chaotic and loud and wonderful. Richard had never felt more at home. He continued his work with the Foundation, which grew over the years into a comprehensive program that addressed not just homelessness, but the underlying causes: mental health support, addiction treatment, job training, affordable housing. Claire joined the board and became one of the program's most effective advocates, using her healthcare experience to push for better integration between medical services and housing support. Together, they testified before City Council, lobbied for policy changes, visited the facilities they funded to talk with residents and staff. The work was challenging and often frustrating, but it was meaningful, and doing it together made it even more so. Claire continued working as a nurse for several more years, though she eventually cut back to part-time so she could focus more on the Foundation work. Richard continued advising his company, but spent most of his time on philanthropic efforts. They found a balance that worked for them, a life that honored both their need for meaningful work and their desire to spend time together. They traveled, not to expensive resorts, but to places that interested them, hiking trips and historical sites in small towns where they could disappear into anonymity for a while. They had adventures and quiet moments and everything in between. About 3 years into their marriage, Claire's health took a concerning turn. She'd been feeling unusually tired, experiencing some pain that she'd initially dismissed as the result of long shifts and getting older. But when it persisted, Richard finally convinced her to see a doctor. The diagnosis was breast cancer, caught early but still terrifying. Richard remembered how Claire had described losing Michael to cancer, how devastating that had been, and he was determined to be there for her in every way possible. He went to every appointment, every treatment session. He held her hand through the bad days, the days when the chemotherapy made her sick and exhausted. He shaved his head when she lost her hair, a gesture she rolled her eyes at, but that he could tell touched her deeply. Emily came down from Albany as often as she could, and the three of them became a tight unit through those difficult months. Claire faced cancer the same way she faced everything, with quiet courage and practical determination. She researched her treatment options thoroughly, asked pointed questions of her doctors, made informed decisions about her care. She also allowed herself to be vulnerable in a way Richard had rarely seen, crying when she was scared, admitting when she needed help, accepting support from the people who loved her. The experience brought them even closer, if that was possible. Richard learned what it meant to be a true partner through crisis, not trying to fix everything or make it better, but just being present, providing steady support, handling the practical details so Claire could focus on healing. And Claire learned to lean on him in a way she'd always been reluctant to do before, trusting him completely with her vulnerability. After months of treatment, Claire's scans came back clear. The cancer was gone, beaten back into remission. The relief was overwhelming, a reminder of how precious and fragile life was. They celebrated with a small gathering of close friends and family, nothing elaborate, just the people who'd supported them through the hardest time. And Richard found himself thinking about the night he'd proposed, about how he'd said he wanted to spend the rest of his life with Claire. He'd meant it then, but he understood it differently now, more deeply. Life wasn't guaranteed. Time together wasn't infinite. Every day was a gift, and the most important thing was to show up for each other, to be present, to love fully and honestly for whatever time you had. As the years passed, Richard and Claire's life together took on the comfortable rhythms of a long marriage. They knew each other's patterns and preferences, could communicate with a look or a gesture, had developed their own private language of inside jokes and shared memories. They still had disagreements, of course, moments of frustration or miscommunication. But they'd learned how to fight fair, how to address problems directly rather than letting resentment build, how to apologize sincerely and forgive fully. Their foundation continued to grow, touching more lives each year. Richard would sometimes visit the programs they funded and talk with residents, and invariably someone would ask him how he got interested in this work. In the early years, he'd been vague, uncomfortable with the truth. But as time went on, he became more willing to share his story, to talk about the 2 months he'd spent pretending to be homeless and what he'd learned from that experience. He was always careful to acknowledge how wrong it had been, how it had been a violation of the dignity of people who were actually living that reality. But he also talked about how it had changed him, how it had opened his eyes to realities he'd been insulated from, how it had led him to want to do something meaningful with his privilege and resources. Some people judged him harshly for it, and he accepted that. He'd made a selfish choice that had hurt people, and there were consequences to that. But others appreciated his honesty, his willingness to admit his mistakes, and his commitment to doing better. And a few people like Tommy, said that however wrong the beginning had been, the ending was making a real difference. That had to count for something. Richard thought about that a lot, about whether good actions could redeem bad beginnings, about whether intentions mattered when the impact had been harmful. He didn't have clear answers, but he kept trying to do better, to use his resources and his platform to address real problems, to honor the dignity of every person he encountered. It was an ongoing process, a commitment to growth that would last the rest of his life. About 7 years into their marriage, Claire surprised Richard with news he hadn't expected. She wanted to write a book. Not about their relationship. She was clear about that. Their story was private, and she had no interest in turning it into public spectacle. But about her experiences as a nurse, about the patients who'd taught her about resilience and grace, and the human capacity to endure. About the healthcare system's failures and the small acts of kindness that made a difference. About grief and hope and the complicated reality of caring for people at their most vulnerable. Richard encouraged her enthusiastically, setting up a home office where she could write, giving her time and space to work on the project. Claire spent the next 2 years writing, working in the early mornings before her shifts and on her days off. She interviewed other nurses, patients she'd stayed in touch with, families who'd experienced loss. She wove together stories and observations and hard-earned wisdom into a manuscript that was both heartbreaking and hopeful. When the book was published, it resonated with readers in a way neither of them had anticipated. It became a bestseller, not because it was sensational, but because it was honest and human and deeply felt. Claire did interviews and readings, speaking to nursing students and grief groups, and anyone who wanted to understand what it meant to care for others in their darkest moments. Richard attended every event he could, sitting in the back of bookstores and community centers, watching his wife share her wisdom with the world and feeling immense pride. This was who she was, who she'd always been. Someone who saw suffering and didn't look away. Someone who showed up with compassion and practical help. Someone who made the world better just by being in it. And he got to be married to her. He got to wake up next to her every morning and fall asleep beside her every night. He got to be her partner in all things. That was the real wealth he'd been searching for all along. On their 10th anniversary, Richard and Claire returned to Washington Square Park one more time. It had become a tradition of sorts, going back to the place where they'd met, where everything had started. They walked to the corner where Richard had set up his spot, where Claire had first stopped and asked if he was hungry. The city had changed over the decade. Some things better, some things worse, but this spot remained. They stood there together, holding hands, remembering. "Do you ever regret it?" Richard asked suddenly. The question had been on his mind lately, as their anniversary approached. "Do you ever wish you'd never stopped that day, never gotten involved with someone who started your relationship with such a massive lie?" Claire was quiet for a moment, thinking. Then she said, "I regret the pain. I regret the months of wondering what was real and what wasn't. I regret the work it took to rebuild trust. But do I regret stopping? Do I regret meeting you? No, never. Because what we have now, what we've built together, it's real. And it's worth everything it took to get here." She paused, then added, "But Richard, you have to stop asking me this question. You have to stop waiting for me to change my mind or decide I can't forgive you after all. I'm here. I chose you. I choose you every day. And I need you to trust that choice." Richard nodded, feeling the truth of her words settle into him. "You're right," he said. "I'm sorry. I'll work on that." Claire smiled and leaned into him. "Good. Because I have better things to do than constantly reassure you that I still love you. I'd rather just love you." They stood there a while longer, watching the park come alive with the evening crowd, joggers and dog walkers and couples and families, all moving through their own lives, their own stories. And Richard thought about the question that had started everything, whether someone could love him without his money. He'd gotten his answer, definitively and completely. Yes. But he'd also learned that the question itself had been flawed. Because love wasn't about what you had or didn't have. It wasn't about tests or proof or validation. Love was about choice. It was about showing up, being honest, doing the work. It was about forgiving and being forgiven. It was about building something together that was stronger than either person alone. And most importantly, love was about trust, the kind of trust that could be broken but also rebuilt, the kind of trust that deepened over time as you proved yourself reliable, as you showed up day after day, year after year, in all the small and large ways that mattered. Richard and Claire walked out of the park hand in hand, heading home to the life they'd created together. A life that was full of purpose and joy and meaning. A life that honored both their individual passions and their shared commitment to making a difference. A life built on honesty, even when honesty was hard. A life that had started with a lie but had been redeemed by truth. And as they walked through the city streets, past homeless individuals sitting with their cups and their cardboard signs, Richard made eye contact with each one, acknowledged their humanity, sometimes stopped to give money or buy a meal. He would never forget what he'd learned during those 2 months. He would never stop seeing the people others walked past. And he would never stop being grateful for the woman beside him, the woman who'd taught him what love really looked like. Sometimes the greatest wealth isn't what you own, but who stays when you have nothing. Claire had stayed. She'd stayed through deception and confession, through anger and forgiveness, through cancer and recovery, through ordinary days and extraordinary ones. She'd stayed because she'd chosen to, because she believed in what they were building together, because she saw something in him worth fighting for. And Richard had learned to stay too, not just physically but emotionally, to be fully present, to be honest even when it was uncomfortable, to show up for her the way she'd shown up for him. That was the real lesson of his entire journey. Not that love without money was possible, though it was, but that love without honesty was impossible. And that the courage to be vulnerable, to be fully seen, flaws and all, that was what made connection real. Years later, when Richard was in his 60s and Claire in her 70s, they would sit on their porch in the evening and talk about their lives, about the choices they'd made and the roads they'd traveled. And sometimes Richard would bring up that night in September when he'd decided to become homeless, when he'd stripped away everything and stepped into the unknown. And Claire would ask him the same question she'd asked before: was it worth it? Not the deception. They both agreed that was wrong and always would be, but the journey itself, the things he'd learned, the person he'd become. And Richard would think about Tommy, now running his own contracting business and mentoring other formerly homeless individuals. He'd think about Maria, who'd passed away a few years back, but who'd spent her last years housed and cared for. He'd think about the thousands of people their foundation had helped over the years, the lives that had been changed, the dignity that had been restored. He'd think about his relationship with Claire, the depth and richness of it, the way it had challenged him and changed him and made him better. And he'd say, I made a terrible choice that hurt people, but I tried to learn from it. I tried to make amends. I tried to turn it into something that helped others. So was the journey worth it? I don't know if I'm the right person to answer that, but I know I'm not the same person I was before, and I think that matters. And Claire would nod and take his hand, and they'd sit together in comfortable silence, watching the sun set, grateful for another day together, another chance to love and be loved. Because in the end, that was what it was all about. Not money or status or proving anything. Just love. Real, honest, complicated, beautiful love. The kind of love that stayed. The kind of love that was worth everything. If you were in Claire's place, would you have forgiven him, or would you have walked away? Could you see past the deception to the genuine connection underneath, or would the lie have been too much to overcome? Think about the relationships in your own life, the trust that holds them together, the honesty that makes them real. We all make mistakes. We all fall short of who we want to be. But what defines us isn't the mistakes, it's what we do after. How we make amends. How we grow. How we show up for the people we love, day after day, in all the ways that matter. Richard's story isn't really about a billionaire testing love. It's about a lonely person searching for connection and making terrible choices in that search. It's about consequences and forgiveness and the hard work of building something real. It's about the courage to be vulnerable and the grace to give second chances. And it's a reminder that sometimes the greatest wealth isn't what you own, but who stays when you have nothing, who sees you at your worst and chooses to believe in your best, who forgives the unforgivable and helps you become someone worthy of that forgiveness. If this story resonated with you, if it made you think about your own relationships and choices, hit that like button and let us know in the comments. Tell us where you're watching from. Tell us your thoughts on forgiveness and second chances. Tell us about a time when someone showed you grace you didn't deserve. And don't forget to subscribe, because we bring you stories like this, stories that challenge you to think, to feel, to examine your own life and choices. Stories that remind us all of our shared humanity, our capacity for both mistakes and growth, our need for connection, and our responsibility to each other. Thank you for staying with us through this entire journey. We know it was long, we know it was complicated, but we hope it was worth your time. We hope it left you thinking, feeling, maybe seeing the world a little differently. Until next time, remember to treat everyone you meet with dignity and kindness, because you never know what journey they're on, what pain they're carrying, what grace they might need, and you never know when you might need that grace yourself.